Good morning. Good morning. I have a request. If this week you guys could all read Ephesians 2:10. And then I was going to talk a little bit about this week. I can't steal the time from the master here, so talk about it last week, but I appreciate if you would read it. It's a great verse. So let me just open in prayer and then we'll put Richard to work, right? Father, we just come to you this morning and we're so grateful. Number one, Lord, we're grateful for the country we live in. We're grateful for our families and that we can be here, especially, Lord, that we can be studying your word. And I just pray for Richard that he, to his wisdom, would open our heart with the study that he's going to give us today. And Lord, I continually pray for Israel, for all of the atrocities that are going on over there. And you're the only one, the only one, Father, that can solve this. And you're the only one that can solve our cultural problems also in our country. So I just pray that you would use each and every one of us in a mighty way, the way that you had planned to use us, even before we were born. To quicken our heart, quicken our spirits, quicken our influence, so that people can see you. Father, we just ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Well, it's good to be with all of you again this morning. And I thought we've been, the last several times I've been with you, I've been talking about just following Jesus and just looking at how Jesus walked with his disciples. And it's always good to examine that, because how he walked with those disciples is fundamentally how he's going to walk with you as well. And so when you study how he related to his 12, then you can anticipate the kind of things he's going to do in your life as well. And when you see some of the failures that those disciples had, and you have to always remember, people like Peter and James and John, they saw the physical Jesus. I witnessed all kinds of incredible miracles. They heard Jesus explaining parables in his teaching as they walked along the roadside, and they still messed up. They still fell short. And we don't necessarily get to see some of the stuff they saw. So if they were vulnerable, then certainly we're vulnerable as well. We ought to never assume that what happened to the 12 would never happen to us. And as Dave mentioned, I think we're all been watching and praying for what's happening in Israel and Hamas and so on. And I've tried to follow that and pray for that. And one of the things that I think it was somewhat some things aren't surprising about what people are doing. If anyone who studied the situation will know a lot of the dynamics that are in play there. But certainly one of the things I think that was surprising was that Israel was caught by surprise. They tend to have very, very good, some of the best security and intelligence in the world. It's in their best interest to do that. Their very survival depends upon them knowing what their enemies are planning to do. And of course, they struck at a time that was a symbolic day in the lives of at least Hamas and the enemies of Israel. Kind of like 9/11, they picked a symbolic day and they struck, and Israel seems to have been caught unprepared, and the enemies came in and butchered all kinds of innocent people before Israel could respond appropriately. And that was certainly surprising and disappointing. I'm sure Israel is doing a lot of soul searching about how that never happens again. In fact, one of the tragic events, you had hundreds of young people celebrating, partying about peace, even as enemy paratroopers are descending and getting ready to kill a bunch of them. And just the paradox of that, having a peace party while your enemies are descending upon you to kill you, the irony of that, the paradox of one side celebrating peace while the other side is moving in to kill, is quite a disturbing imagery. And yet I think one thing that the Western world, we're not always really good at this, but seeing evil for what it is. You know, it's one thing if you're an army and you're trying to fight another army to gain some territory, that's one thing. But when you charge into a house filled with unarmed civilians, children, babies, and you take delight in just murdering them and dismembering them, and just celebrate beheading a corpse and stabbing a corpse, the depths of just evil that would cause a heart to be that hardened toward another human being is there's just no explanation for that. You can talk about injustices and whatever else you want, but there's a certain extent where you just say that's just pure evil, to treat someone that way, mercilessly, rape, kills, take people's babies after you've shot their parents. And I've meditated upon that, to say, you know, that the same evil that would cause someone to butcher an innocent family is the very same evil that wants to destroy your family, wants to destroy America, wants to destroy your church. And we need to be just as vigilant as the Israelis do, because people might not parachute into your backyard to kill you, but evil has many, many ways to destroy you as well. And we can't be any less alert than the Israelis were a couple of weeks ago. And I was looking at a passage that's quite interesting to me. It's found in Luke chapter 22. And I want you just to walk through with me a little bit of this chapter. Later, you might just want to just carefully read through it yourself. It's also during a Jewish holiday. Festival of Unleavened Bread, of course. Passover is upon them, and if you were to talk to the 12 disciples and ask them how are things going, they would say great. To them, it was kind of like their Thanksgiving holiday. It was a time of family and celebration and gathering with friends, having a nice meal, and so they were looking forward to it. And they had just come into Jerusalem that week, and the crowds had been cheering them, and Jesus had been teaching powerfully in the temple all week, performing some miracles. And so if you'd asked the 12 disciples, how are things going? They would have said, that's been one of the best weeks we've ever had. We're kind of at the peak of our ministry. And it can seem, of course, something you always have to be alert to is that you never fall farther than when you're at your height. And Peter and the other disciples, in many ways, they're at the height of their ministry at this point. They've just had a hero's welcome in Jerusalem, and yet they've never been closer to their worst failure, their worst defeat, the worst attack from evil, the enemy against them. And so even as they are preparing for a wonderful meal together, they're unaware that Judas has now struck a deal with the Jews, and he's now looking for an opportunity to betray them. And of course, I've talked with lots of men over the years that look back later and realize that they had not been paying attention when their child started dabbling in drugs, or the enemy, the evil one, found an inroad into their family or into their house. And again, just to be reminded that we live in an evil age, and while everything might look fine on the outside, for all we know, Judas has already struck a deal for our family as well, and evil is making its way in. And so they meet, and they're celebrating their meal together. And interestingly, verse 24 of that chapter, it says that here, as they're actually at probably one of the most critical moments in their entire lives, their entire ministry. Satan is about to just come at them with a flood. The disciples are arguing about which of them is the greatest. Their discussion is light years away from where it ought to be. They ought to be talking about how to be prepared for the attacks that are coming, how to support one another, how to uplift each other. Instead, they're being divided. They're comparing each other, and they're talking about things that don't even matter, that aren't even important. And I thought to myself, certainly every time there's a crisis of some kind in the world, the kinds of things that God's people spend so much time talking about that doesn't even matter. And what should we be talking about in an evil age such as this? And so that's kind of the context for where I want to begin to just zero in verse 31 of Luke 22. And so here they're having this nice meal, and Jesus understands. Jesus is fully aware that his entire ministry is coming to a climax here. He knows that his enemies have never been more resolute to destroy him than right now, that he's more vulnerable to their attacks than he's ever been. And yet I've often thought to myself, when I look at my life, when I look at my church, my country, I might look at it and say, oh, things are, going pretty well right now. But if you were to ask Jesus, he might say, you've never been more vulnerable. Your family's never been more vulnerable. Jesus said he was the truth. And as my dad liked to say, you don't really know what the truth of your situation is until you've heard from him. So things may seem good to you, but hold off on your final judgment till you've talked to Jesus, and he might have a very different opinion. And so Simon is sitting back there enjoying himself. And all of a sudden, verse 31, Jesus changes the whole tenor of the conversation, and he says, Simon, Simon, look out, Satan has asked to sift you like wheat, but I prayed for you that your faith may not fail, and you, when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. And of course, we've looked at this before, but Peter has two names, Simon that he was known for, and then Peter that Jesus calls him. And we've looked at this before. Your name represented your character, represented who you were. And when Jesus renames him Peter, there's a lot of discussion about exactly what that meant, but it seems to imply that he was being called a rock, that Jesus was saying, you will be a foundation, you'll be solid as a rock. But it was a prophetic kind of naming, because Peter wasn't rock-like when Jesus named him that. Jesus was saying, you hang around with me long enough and you'll become rock-like, but you're not there yet. And so it's not, you can't always take this to the bank, but there are times where it's interesting to me to note which name Jesus uses with Peter. Does he call him Peter? Does he call him Simon? And sometimes I think that indicates how he's behaving. If he's acting more like a Simon, that's maybe what Jesus calls him. If he's acting more like a Peter, then maybe that's what he gets called. And so here he calls him Simon, and he calls him Simon twice. And of course, you know this, when in the Bible, when someone uses your name twice, then they're saying, listen, pay attention. They're trying to get your attention. To call your name, when Jesus calls your name once, that ought to be enough to get your attention. But when he calls your name twice, you really don't want to miss that. But he's calling him Simon. He's a double Simon right now. He's about to experience the most unrock-like moment in his life. And so he's definitely a double Simon here. And he says, Satan is asked to sift you like wheat. And I've been doing some study with the sermon on the Lord's Prayer. And, Jesus there said a couple of things that were interesting. He said, lead us not into temptation. And that's kind of an interesting prayer. Why would God ever lead you into temptation? God doesn't tempt us. He's not evil. Would he lead you into a place where you might be tempted? Well, yeah, anywhere he leads us, there's going to be temptation waiting for us there. But a lot of people feel like what that's saying is, God, don't let me succumb to temptation. If I'm in a place, God, give me the strength not to be overcome. And then he goes on to say, and deliver us from evil. And again, it doesn't say that God will prevent you from encountering evil. Doesn't mean that he'll keep evil at bay and not let evil get close to you or your family. But our prayer is, when we do encounter evil, God, deliver us from it. And the Bible does say that there's no temptation, there's no evil that can come against you that God will not give you the strength to overcome it. And so Jesus says Satan has asked to sift you like wheat. And if you can imagine the way you would shake wheat and thresh wheat to separate the wheat from the chaff, the grain from the chaff, it was a pretty violent kind of shaking that you did in the wind. And it was not gentle. You had to shake it hard if you wanted to separate the grain from the chaff. And so Jesus is saying Satan has asked Peter to take you and shake you for all that you're worth, to shake your life right to the core. And it's interesting, of course, Jesus, just like with Job, Satan does not have the freedom just to do anything he wants in your life. There has to be a certain permission from God for him to do this. Satan does not have a free-for-all just to do anything he wants. But in a world of free choice, Satan does have a certain level of freedom. And so Satan has been given permission to try Peter. And of course, Jesus knows Peter one day will be a cornerstone of the church. He'll be a foundation, an apostle, a great preacher, evangelist, Bible book writer. But that will only come after he's gone through a time of shaking first. And he knows, Jesus knows that's part of the process for him. And but he's warning him, he's preparing him. And it is interesting. He says, one of those verses you have to kind of wrestle with, verse 32, it says, but I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. So, I mean, if Jesus is praying for you that your faith in him won't fail, you'd think that you'd be probably in pretty good shape for whatever was coming. But we know Jesus prayed for Peter and he failed miserably. So what does that mean? Jesus prayed that his faith wouldn't fail, and then he ends up denying he even knows Jesus 3 times. So what does that say about Jesus' prayers? Did they work, or did Jesus' prayers, were they not effective? That's kind of one of those interesting questions. I think maybe what it means is Jesus was saying your faith in me is not going to fail. Now you may fail, you may even deny me, but your faith will be resilient. It'll still be there on the other side of your worst failure. So Jesus always has a long view when he's looking at us, not just a temporary one. And so there are times when we go through a tough time and we say, well, I thought God loved me. Here Peter could have said, well, Jesus, I thought you were praying for me. Why did I fail? And Jesus would say, well, you didn't ultimately fail. You did have a setback, but that doesn't mean your faith failed completely. You did make it to the other side. And so there are times where we may go through a time of setback, a time of momentary failure, but Jesus is praying long-term. He's praying that we'll get to the other side of that, and that we'll end up being stronger, more humble than we ever were before. And he says, when you have gotten back on your feet, encourage others, encourage your brothers. And I think that's one of the great benefits of our failures, is that once we're to the other side, we can take those failures, those things we're perhaps ashamed of, and turn around and be an encouragement to others. And that's why I think it doesn't hurt sometimes to tell others about our failures, our setbacks. We don't glory in them, but I've done a lot of public speaking, and oftentimes the sharing that seems to have the most impact is when I'm sharing from my weakness, from my failures. Some people love just to tell about all their successes, and I don't necessarily get nearly as much help from people that just tell me how good they are. But when they tell me about their setbacks and how by the grace of God, God got them back on their feet, that encourages me. And so I think in part that's what Jesus is saying. There's a purpose in this, Peter, and you are gonna be shaken like sifted like wheat. But when you get through it, then mine that failure, reap all the benefit you can from that failure. And one of the ways you do it is by encouraging others with what you learned in your own setback. But and of course, if Jesus were to come to you, if God were to come to you and say your name twice, Simon, Simon, Richard, Richard, beware, you're vulnerable. The evil is coming to get you. And of course, there's always, that historians always study those moments, like with Pearl Harbor and other times where we were caught by surprise. And then they look back later and they say, well, there was all kinds of evidence. There was radio messages. There were some different things happening that should have been a red flag to us, but we didn't connect the dots. We didn't realize what was going on. And, one question I'd have for you would be, because obviously Jesus is trying to get Peter's attention here. He's trying to prepare him for what he knows is coming. And yet, even when he says flat out, I mean, I don't know about you, but I would hope that if Jesus called my name twice and then said, Satan has just asked that he can shake you fiercely to destroy you, I'd be leaning in at that point. I'd have some questions I'd want to ask, like, well, Jesus, where is he going to do that? If Jesus had said, well, you'll be in the courtyard of the high priest tonight and you're going to deny you even know me, I would say, okay, well, I know one thing. I'm not going to the courtyard of the high priest tonight. If he said, well, there'll be a servant girl who's going to ask you if you know me, and you're going to flat out lie and curse and say you don't, I'll tell you what, every servant girl I saw coming that night, I'd run the other way. I mean, you think that Jesus tries to warn you that you'd be right on top of it and to say, well, I tell you what, Jesus, if he said, well, you'll be all alone, surrounded by servants of the high priest and others, I'll tell you what, I would have stayed right next to John the whole time. I would have had other disciples with me. I mean, you hope that you would take action so that you weren't vulnerable after Jesus got your attention. But, a question I'd have for you is, when God really wants to get your attention, what does he do? He might not call your name twice, but I think all of us, we all have a unique walk with God, and he has many ways of getting our attention. You'd think when he said, Simon, Simon, and then said, Satan has personally asked to come after you, that would have been enough to get Peter's attention. But then I think about my own life, and what are the ways where God, when he really wants to get my attention, what does he do? I'll tell you, for one, it's if my wife, he gets my attention through my wife. If my wife is hurting, my wife's upset, my wife is struggling, or one of my kids is going through a hard time, that's often a time where I really rein in and go to God and say, God, what's going on? What am I the man of God I need to be right now? Am I prepared for what my family is facing? There are times where you see some of the horror even happening in Israel and just want to get alone with God and say, God, I've been reminded again of how awful evil is in this world. And am I prepared for what evil wants to do in my country and my church, my nation? It could be a health issue. Sometimes when we feel good physically, we can maybe neglect God, and then all of a sudden the doctor says, hey, I want to do some more tests. I've found something I want to check out. What does it take for God to get your attention, where he knows when this happens, you kind of know it's time to get serious with God? Maybe it's a financial downturn. But here Jesus calls his name and says, Satan's coming to get you. You'd think that would have been enough. But Peter ignores even that and basically says, Lord, I'm ready to go with you both to prison and to death. And Jesus said, I tell you, Peter, the rooster will not crow today until you deny 3 times that you know me. And so at a time when Peter has never felt more confident is when he's now the most vulnerable. And I've had people say before, I always worry about people who say, well, I would just never, this particular sin just doesn't tempt me. Or, I know I'm not perfect, but that's just not an area of my life that I struggle. Well, maybe you don't right now, but be careful that you don't ever think that you are invincible in any area of your life. Every time I see a minister or a friend of mine fall morally, I always want to say, God, I don't want to ever think that under the right situation, in a moment of weakness or foolishness, that I might not make some foolish choice like that as well. Lord, just help fortify me so that I would never do that. But Peter seems to have far too much confidence in his ability, and it's the irony is he's never been closer to the worst failure of his life while he's boasting about the fact that he's fully prepared. And that always makes me think, if Peter could overestimate his walk with God, then certainly we're vulnerable of that as well. And we can overestimate our walk with God, our prayer life, our commitment to Christ. And have you ever known people that you look to as a strong Christian, a committed follower of Jesus, and now they maybe don't even go to church anymore? They're not anywhere near where they used to be. And you just say, there was a time when they would have thought that was ridiculous to even consider. And yet they were vulnerable and they weren't aware of it. And so what's interesting too, verse 35, Jesus says, when I sent you out without money bag, traveling bag, or sandals, did you lack anything? Not a thing, they said. Then he said to them, but now whoever has a money bag should take it, and also a traveling bag, and whoever doesn't have a sword should sell his robe and buy one. So remember earlier, he had sent his disciples out. He sent the 70 out, and he told them then, don't even bring an extra garment. Don't bring money with you. And it was really, he was giving them an opportunity to build their faith, where they would go out and not know what they were going to eat and just have to rely upon God's provision. It was a faith building exercise. But this time he says, now last time I sent you out, I told you, don't bring a lot of provisions, just trust God. Don't even bring a sword, so that you have to trust God even for your safety. But now he says, if you don't have a sword, make sure you have one, which is interesting because, of course, he never commands them to use the sword, never commands them to kill people or force people to do anything. And so I think it is, I don't think he's saying arm yourself and go out and try to conquer unbelievers the way Muhammad did with Islam. But I think what he is saying is, you are now entering into a very evil, dangerous age, and you need to be armed. You need to be prepared. And obviously, your defense really is not going to be with a real sword. But I think he is saying you are entering into a spiritual battle here, a spiritual warfare. And you don't be naive. Be spiritually armed for sure. And so they, of course, oftentimes when he talks to them this way, they miss his point. They take it literally. And it says, verse 38, Lord, they said, look, here are 2 swords. That's enough, he told them. Now, so I think he's talking spiritually to them. They take it literally, and they say, well, hey, Lord, look, we have 2 swords with us. And of course, if he really wanted everybody to have a sword, there's 13 of them there, not counting 12 if you don't count Judas. And he says 2 swords is enough, which tells me that he wasn't meaning that every person needed to have their own sword. I think what he's saying is, I kind of read that not so much it's enough, 2 swords will be enough, but it's like, okay, you don't get it. You don't understand what I'm saying. That's enough. And so and now, of course, it doesn't say who has those 2 swords, but if you were betting men and you knew that there's 11 disciples left and there's 2 swords, who's going to be stepping up saying, I'll take one of those swords? Peter. Yeah. You just kind of, and of course, we know that ultimately that is what happens, that he does have one of the swords. We never do know who the other person who had the sword, because interestingly, when the Judas and his mob arrive, Peter is going to pull out that sword and he is going to use it. We never hear about the other sword. Someone else in that crowd had a sword, but either he just, I'm guessing what happened is when he saw that mob of armed men and and you got two fishermen there carrying swords who don't really know how to use them. I think the other guy must have been smarter than Peter and thought, if I pull out this sword, I'm just going to get killed. That's all that's going to happen. Whereas Peter, in his rashness, he's going to brandish that sword. He's going to use it. And so again, I think Jesus, in his own way, was saying, we're about to face evil. We're about to face darkness. Are you prepared? Are you spiritually armed? And I just see a lot of Christians that are spiritually defenseless. And the enemy comes and we're totally unprepared. We're disarmed. Our enemy is armed to the teeth, and the church hasn't even bothered to bring a slingshot. And so but what's interesting is, so after all that preparation, what is it that Jesus does next? Well, the next thing he does is he takes them to a place of prayer. And I'll tell you what, when Jesus tells you need to be praying right now, he knows what's coming next. To us, we might say, well, I just don't really have time right now to pray, or I'm not really a morning person. I don't know that I feel like getting up and praying. And Jesus would say, if you knew what was coming, you'd be on your knees praying. When Jesus tells you to start praying, it doesn't have to make sense to you. You don't know the future like he does. You don't know where the enemy is about to attack like he does. Just trust and pray. And by the way, what is Peter boasted? Peter has said, I'm the one guy that you can take it to the bank, Jesus. You can trust me. Even if all these other half-hearted, ne'er-do-well disciples of yours all run away and give up on you, you know I'll still be standing at your side. You know I'll never let you down. And so what does Jesus do? In a sense, he tests them. And the test is not, okay, let's see how you do in hand-to-hand combat. Do you know the test that Jesus has for how committed you are as a disciple of his? Your prayer life. And he says, okay, you said you'd die for me, but would you pray for me? And I'll tell you what, if you won't pray, don't overestimate your ability to die for Jesus, to live for him, if you won't even pray for him. And so Jesus comes and he takes the three of the inner circle disciples even closer with him. Peter's in that group. And then you know what happens. Jesus comes back a couple of times, and every time he finds them sleeping. And I don't know about you, but because I keep thinking, if I were Peter, when would it have dawned on me that I wasn't in as good a shape as I thought I was? Would it be when Jesus warned me? Or would it be when Jesus has to shake me awake? Here I told him, you can count on me, Jesus. And the next thing I know, he's having to shake me awake and ask me, could I not even pray with him for an hour? When I'm failing in my prayer life, should that be a warning to me that maybe my walk with God is not as serious as I think it is? And so then, but like I keep thinking, like, how many things would have to go wrong in my life before it dawned on me, I better get my walk with God in shape here, because I'm not in the place that I thought I was. Verse 47 says, suddenly a mob came, and one of the 12 named Judas was leading them. He kisses Jesus. And verse 49, when those around him saw what was going to happen, they asked, Lord, should we strike with the sword? And so some of them asked, maybe it was the other guy, whoever the other disciple was, asked, should we strike? But Peter doesn't wait for the answer. It says, then one of them struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. Now it's interesting because Luke is gracious enough, doesn't name names. It doesn't say it was Peter. Matthew doesn't. He says someone did it, but doesn't name him. Mark tells that kind of unusual story of a young man that fled away naked. that was in the garden that night as well. And most people believe that probably was Mark. He's talking about himself, doesn't name himself, but that may well have been John Mark that was in the garden in the area that night as well. So because he's writing that gospel, he tells that story. John is the only one that actually names names. And John was Peter's good friend. And I'm thinking, well, thanks a lot, John. You had to let everybody know it was me that messed up. Of course, everybody would have known that story. And of course, John writes later than the other gospel writers. Most people believe he wrote last. And so part of what John does is he fills in some details that people might have been wondering about, when they read Mark's gospel or Luke's. Well, who was the guy who cut off the ear? So John mentions it, but here Luke just discreetly doesn't mention that. Of course, Luke has been a companion of Paul, and maybe he's trying to just not embarrass him or make it worse, but for Peter and those leaders. But then verse 51. So I mean, for Peter's sake, he does. He does take on a whole cohort of hired thugs, all carrying weapons and lanterns. And one fisherman takes a swipe with his sword. Of course, he kind of fights like a fisherman, misses the guy's head, cuts off his ear. But to his credit, I mean, he had some courage there. He did single-handedly try to defend Jesus and the other disciples. You got to give him some credit for that. But then verse 51, but Jesus responded, "No more of this." I mean, if you were Peter and you see maybe a couple hundred men all coming in to capture your rabbi, your teacher, and you step in front of Jesus and your friends, you pull out your sword and you put your life on the line, you're probably expecting something else from Jesus than no more of this. You're probably expecting him to say, well, Peter, you were right. You would die for me. You would put your life on the line for me. None of these other disciples, the whoever it is that has the other sword, he certainly didn't do that. So you're kind of thinking that Peter is expecting at least some kind of recognition or praise or gratitude. Instead, he's basically rebuked. And of course, and I wrote a book earlier this year called The Ways of God, and part of our problem is we keep trying to do God's work the world's way. And then instead of being blessed by it, praised by it, thanked for it, we're rebuked. And Jesus would say, no more of that. That's how Hollywood does it. That's how the military does it. That's how the world does it. But that's not how we do things. And I think that was probably a very dissettling moment for Peter, because he's literally put his life on the line, and he's done what he thought was the right thing to do. And instead of being blessed for it, he's rebuked for it. And I think that really puts Peter off balance from that point onward. From that point onward, Peter's not the same. He starts to he's lost his confidence, and perhaps you have done that at times where you meant well. You were trying to do the right thing, but the way you did it, God chose not to bless. And it's confusing. Hey, I was going to give God all the glory for this, but God doesn't make it successful. And you wonder, well, God, why? I mean, I did this for you. Why are you not blessing it? Why are you not grateful for what I'm doing? But it might be because we're not, Jesus knows full well, two fishermen trying to take on a couple hundred hired soldiers is going to lead to a massacre. That's what it's going to do. Doing things your way is going to lead to a disaster. Doing things God's way will turn the world upside down. And so Peter tries to do God's work his way, and then he gets rebuked for it. And so they take Jesus away. And then you get to verse 54. It says, they seized him, led him away, and brought him into the high priest's house. Meanwhile, Peter was following at a distance. So now Peter had said, I'll be right at your right-hand side. You can count on me. but all of a sudden he's following at a distance. And, you know, I would ask, what are the signs? I mean, as Peter looks in the ahead of him and sees there's Jesus up there being bullied and roughed up by a bunch of soldiers, and here I am, I'm still following, but now I'm not by his side anymore. Now I'm at a safe distance behind. I'm lurking in the shadows. I'm not there where Jesus needs me to be. At what point do you realize that you have begun following Jesus at a distance instead of intimately abiding with him? There was a time when you were abiding in Christ, where you were meeting with him regularly, where you were hearing him speak. But then one day it just dawns on you, I'm still going through the motions. I'm still going to church on Sunday, but I'm following at a distance now. I used to follow him much more closely than I am today. And, you know, I think sometimes people can go for years following at a distance, just kind of going through the motions, but there's not that intimacy that there used to be. You're not hearing, you know, Peter can't hear what Jesus is saying when he's following at a distance. He's not close enough to hear Jesus' voice. And all of a sudden you realize, you know what, it's been a while since I've heard from Jesus. It's been a while since we've talked about anything significant. And can you go for years following at a distance? And yet again, here's a guy who was told just that very evening, the enemy's coming for you, Peter. You're vulnerable. And now he's following at a distance. You'd think he would have thought, my goodness, the very things that Jesus warned me about, it looks like it's happening. I better get my act together. I better find John or find Matthew, someone else, and walk with them. And but maybe he thinks, well, a bunch of those other guys have fled into the night. At least I'm still following. It might not be closely, but at least I'm still on the same path. We don't know what he's thinking. But then, of course, you know well, the next part, he gets to the high priest's house. He's lingering in the courtyard, and then a series of people come to him and say, aren't you one of his followers? Aren't you one of his disciples? And 3 times he denies that he knows Jesus. And you wonder, again, you know, sometimes it's good to put yourself there and say, how many times would I have denied Jesus before it dawned on me that I was doing the very thing that Jesus warned me was going to happen? The very thing I swore would never happen to me, I'm in the process of it happening right now. Jesus said I'd strike out. I would deny him 3 times. And when Peter denied him the first time, what should Peter have thought? Well, here I go. I mean, I swore this would never happen. And I've just done it once. And Jesus said it would happen 3 times. I've already got strike 1. I better do something here because I'm headed down the very path Jesus warned me I was going to go down. Then he gets to strike 2. And of course, he's not making any adjustments. He's not changing anything up. He's not fortifying himself. He's not getting around other disciples. He's not getting out of the area. He's not trying to get closer to Jesus. He's just kind of sitting there like a target, just waiting for the enemy to shoot at him again. And finally, he denies he knows Jesus 3 times, just like Jesus said. And what's interesting is, at what point does that break Peter? At what point is he finally crushed by his sense of failure? You know, it wasn't after he denies him 1 time. It's not after he denies him a 2nd time. Even after he denies him a 3rd time, you would think, even as that 3rd denial was passing across his lips, that Peter it would have dawned on him, well, I've just done what Jesus warned me I was going to do. But you don't even hear that. And then it says, immediately while he was still speaking, a rooster crowed. You would think when that rooster crowed that would have struck him right to his heart, and he would have realized, well, Jesus was right. He knew all along and he told me. I should have responded to that warning of Jesus, but I just a dumb ox. I just kept marching right to the slaughter here and made no adjustments. But even then, even when the rooster crows, it doesn't say that Peter was shaken, that he recognized what he did. Of course, what it says in verse 61, it says, then the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And of course, Jesus is farther away from Peter. And it says a cohort was beating Jesus up. They were spitting in his face. They were mocking him, hitting him, cursing him. And a cohort, I mean, a full cohort could consist of up to 500 men. Most people don't think there was necessarily 500 men there, but there would have been a sizable number of hardened soldiers that were going to have some fun with some Jewish man, to kind of spice up their otherwise boring evening. And so while they're bullying this man, try to imagine if you've got even 50 men surrounding you while you're bound, and they're punching you in the head, they're spitting in your face, they're cursing in your face, mocking you, laughing. Try to imagine 50 men surrounding you, beating on you, and you being aware of anything that's going on anywhere else around you. All you're doing is getting ready for the next blow to your head, trying to get the spit off your face. But the moment that Peter denies Jesus a third time, somehow Jesus turned his gaze from all of his tormentors and locked eyes with Peter. And that moment of seeing Jesus turn from his own persecution and look straight at Peter, and that look told Peter everything that he needed to know. Jesus, without saying a word, just looked at him, and it absolutely devastates Peter. And it says he went out and wept bitterly. And I thought to myself, are you familiar with that look? Are you familiar with that look where Jesus looks at you, and it doesn't have to say a word, doesn't have to heap coals on your head, doesn't have to give you a tongue lashing, just that look of disappointment. That's something that I used to always fear from my dad, was not that he would spank me, but that I would disappoint him. And that look from my dad was just so devastating to me and all of my siblings. That's just one thing we couldn't stand. We'd rather our mother kind of tied into us than to have our dad look at us with disappointment. And that look of disappointment absolutely devastated Peter. And now he gets it. Now he's broken. And he goes out into the night weeping bitterly. And that's where we leave him until Easter morning, where when Mary Magdalene and her friends encounter the risen Jesus, remember one of the first things Jesus tells them? Go and tell Peter and the others, names Peter specifically. Jesus knows full well the anguish, the self-reproach that Peter has been experiencing ever since that night. And Jesus is eager to restore him. And of course, when he encounters them by the seaside and has that conversation with Peter, and I certainly am one that feels like the reason Jesus asked Peter 3 times, do you love me, is because he's letting him walk back each of those denials. And Jesus is very intentional about restoring Peter. And I'm so grateful for that part of the gospel that's recorded, because Peter has one of the most famous failures as a genuine follower of Jesus. And yet it shows us the depth that we can fall when we're being careless, but it also shows you the length that Jesus will go to restore us, that he doesn't hold it against us, that there's no sin that you have ever committed in your life that Jesus still is having a hard time getting over that. And he's going to make you just pay for a few more years before he finally lets it go. Jesus is more eager to be restored with you than we are eager to be restored with him. And I'm glad that that's in there. But I'll stop and see if you have a question or comment. But to me, especially in light of just the evil that is so pervasive and has been exposed in recent days, it just reminds me, and not that people are going to storm into my house and start, shooting all my family, perhaps as Hamas did, but I am very aware that that the same evil that could motivate someone to kill people is the same evil that wants to divide the church I go to, that wants to get the pastor of the church fired, that wants to lead me to betray my wife and indulge in pornography, to lie at work, to live in a way that dishonors Christ. That same evil wants to destroy me as much as it wants to destroy anyone else. And so I want to be alert and vigilant, and to have my spiritual sword in my hand, so that when an enemy comes, I don't have to run defenseless because I wasn't prepared ahead of time. So let me stop there and just see, does someone have a comment or a question this morning?
But we must have be awful smart people. Richard, the one statement you made in the statement that's in your book, where we keep trying to do God's work the world's way.
Yeah.
Can you give us some examples of that?
Well, you know, I mean, one way would be, the world has ways of pressuring you to do what it wants you to do, using force, bullying people. You're seeing a lot of this in culture today, the cancel culture. You know, you don't do things the way we say, we'll cancel you, we'll cause you to lose your job. That's the way the world does it. Jesus doesn't do it that way. Jesus speaks to the heart. Jesus uses love, not force. And I see this even in churches where, you know, the pastor really wants to get something, a new building built. So let's kind of pressure people and put guilt trips on them. Let's use a really slick marketing campaign to kind of woo everybody. But speaking to the heart, speaking out of love, speaking the truth. I see the church often trying to use pressure, force, to get its way, instead of trusting the Holy Spirit to work. You know, trusting in money. The world trusts in money. And I see a lot of churches, they say they trust in God, but they really trust in their budget. They would never do anything that wasn't in the budget, that wasn't in the bank. It doesn't matter if God was telling them to do it or not. And so you look at a church and it says, well, we can't do much. We don't have much money. And God would say, but you have me. If you've got me, you've got everything you need. But a lot of churches, they're driven by their bank account, not by the God who's the head of their church. And so there's, you know, there's people that, I mean, the world is the most talented, it's the most beautiful, most handsome, that garner the limelight. And a lot of times we can buy into that and think, well, I'm not that skilled. I'm not a very good speaker. I've never been in upper management. And God would say, but you have me. Look at the Bible. I'm an expert at using very ordinary people that the world doesn't think much. The world didn't think much of those 12 disciples. The world would never have picked those disciples to be people that changed the world, built the kingdom of God. And yet God would say, but that's the way I'd like doing things, getting ordinary people. I've always said that's why I feel like God used my dad so mightily, because my dad was so ordinary and he was never in danger of thinking it was just his brilliance that accomplished much, that Dad would always know it was God. So yeah, lots of ways, Dave, where we don't even realize it, but I'll just listen to Christians talk and you realize they're not getting that from the Bible right now. They're spewing out what is considered common wisdom, but it's the wisdom the world uses. It's not the wisdom from God's word.
Good examples, thank you.
Richard, I have a question. You mentioned that the swords that he commanded them to go get, and then he said, okay, that's enough. And you said you kind of read into that a different way. You didn't go into a whole lot of detail there, but he commanded them to get swords, and then they use them, and he rebukes them. I understand some of the symbolism of fortifying ourselves and arming ourselves in preparation for what's to come, but in the moment, they legitimately went and got swords because that's what they were told to do, and then they were in trouble for using them. Can you kind ahead, connect those dots for me.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, the Bible doesn't necessarily tell us everything that Jesus was thinking at the time, so we've kind of got to put two and two together there. But yeah, if he really was trying to tell them all, you all need to have physical swords. It's a dangerous time. You're going to be hunted down later tonight. Then he would have. Then if only 2 out of 11 of them had swords, he would have certainly said, "Well, hey, that's not going to do any good. You all need to be armed, not just 2 of you." It's like saying you need to be people of prayer, and only 2 of his disciples said, "Well, we'll pray." He would have wanted them all to pray. And so the fact that he says 2 is enough, I've just kind of taken that just where he's just saying that's I think he just shaking his head. It's like they're not getting any of this. I really do feel like he was thinking more in terms of a spiritual warfare. I think that might have also just been his way of saying, you're about to face really dangerous times right ahead, so be prepared. But of course, all evening long, he's talking about being taken away from them and dying, and they're not picking up on any of what he's saying. They're missing all the allusions, and so I kind of see this in the same camp as he's saying one thing and they're taking it very literally and missing the point, because they grab 2 physical swords, but they're all totally unprepared when they actually are attacked by an enemy. But I do think that's like I said, that's part of Peter's problem is he took it literally, and he did take one of those 2 swords, and he did actually use the sword just like he assumed he was supposed to. And then he gets rebuked. And I've always felt like that was the point that sent him spiraling. I think if they had just gotten into a full out rumble there with fighting sword to sword, Peter would have been in the thick of things to the end. I don't think he was a coward. You can't try to take on 500 soldiers alone with 1 sword and be a coward. I think he was confused is what he was. And when he gets rebuked after heroically taking on 500 enemy soldiers and then gets rebuked for it, I think he was just like, well, what am I supposed to do? Like, how do you please Jesus? I just put my life on the line and he rebuked me. And he's realizing everything I've thought about Jesus, I wonder if I've gotten it right. I love him, but when I try to serve him, he tells me, no, don't do that. And I think you just see him kind of wandering around in a daze ever after that moment. So, but it is an interesting thing, isn't it? That he tells them to have a sword, and then as soon as they pull it out and try to use it, he stops them and says, don't do that. Enough of this. And to me, it's a classic example of thinking the world's way. How does the world use a sword, and how does God use a sword? And it doesn't mean God thinks, just wants you to be a martyr, wants you just to get mowed down, but he just wants you to use his tools, his weapons. And yeah.
In Ephesians 6, it talks about the sword of the Spirit, and the word of God there, the word is rhema. Maybe help us understand what the difference is in the word, where there it's called the rhema of God. You want to explore that versus it's the only place I think that word in Greek is used.
Yeah, the rhema for the speaking of the weapon, the sword of the Spirit.
Yes.
Yeah, and I of course, yeah, we have to remember too that when Jesus is speaking, he's speaking in Arabic, and so when Luke writes this gospel, he takes Arabic words that are Aramaic words that Jesus was speaking, and he chooses a Greek word. So Jesus wouldn't have used that Greek word. He would have been speaking an Aramaic word. So, but still, the writers are, the Greek word they choose, they're trying to get at Jesus' meaning, what he was getting at. And so, I don't know. You can kind of really dig into what kind of sword that's talking about. But I tend to just think he's, sometimes I think those Greek words really matter for sure. But but I think I think just in general, what he's saying is you use spiritual weapons, sword of the spirit, not sword of steel. And so are you fully armed spiritually for the spiritual? And he also says there in Ephesians, we don't fight against principalities and powers like the physical ones, but spiritual powers. And that's far more dangerous than physical swords. So are you spiritually armed for the spirit? And that's why I say sometimes you can see the physical things that people are doing to each other, but you just sense there's a far more powerful evil influence that's at work behind them, that is taking them to depths that humanity might not go to without being motivated by evil. And so I think Jesus always saw the spiritual underpinnings of what these soldiers were doing. Yeah, a Roman soldier with a sword and shield could do some physical damage to you, but Jesus was saying, but my disciples need to be far more alert to the spiritual evil and the spiritual weapons that are coming against us. Yeah. So there's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot there. So I say you just want to read this carefully, but take time to read this chapter sometime and just ask yourself, am I vulnerable for a spiritual ambush? Am I prepared? Am I armed? Am I fully equipped for whatever attack would come? Or is my family, is my church, my business vulnerable as well? Because I might have a physical, gun in my drawer beside my bed, but is my prayer life at a place to protect my family? Are my spiritual eyes alert to the enemy that's lurking about me right now? Or am I oblivious to the inroads that evil is making into my own home right now? Until one day I wake up and I wonder, well, what happened to my grandkids? How did they get so entangled in evil? And I didn't even notice any of that until they were hopelessly in bondage.
Well, thank you, Richard. And next month, we're going to see you in person.
Yeah, I look forward to that. Yeah, so yeah, I'll see you then.
Good. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard.
Good.